Hi, I'm Len Epp from Lean Pub, and in this Front Matter podcast, I'll be interviewing Julie Moronuki. Based in Montana, Julie is an author, speaker, trainer, and consultant who creates books and courses and other teaching and training materials with a particular focus on the Haskel programming language. Along with her colleague Chris Martin, she runs the consultancy Type Class Consulting. You can sign up for their courses and materials at typeclasses.com, and you can find out more about Julie on her website, argumetronic.com, and follow her on Twitter at argumetronic. Julie is a co-author of a Lean Pub book, Finding Success and Failure in Haskel, Fall in Love with Applicative Functors. In the book, yes, Julie and Chris walk you through the creation of a program in Haskell step by step. The book is meant for readers who are getting started writing in Haskell and want to speed up their understanding through quick and clear examples and exercises and actually doing it. In this interview, we're going to talk about Julie's background and career, professional interests, her books, and at the end, we'll talk about her experience self-publishing now. So thank you, Julie, for being on the Front Matter podcast.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
I always like to start these interviews by asking people for their origin story. You have a particularly interesting one with respect to how you came into teaching Haskell. Can you talk a little bit about where you grew up and your first experience, how you came to have an interest in Haskell?
Well, where I grew up, that's a really difficult question. I've moved a lot, both in my childhood and as an adult. So I've lived in, the number of states I've lived in, I think, is in the double digits. And I lived in Japan for a while as well. So, I was, so I have my master's degree in linguistics, and I had taken some time off. Well, I had been a librarian and I was doing some teaching online, but I was taking some time off from full-time work, at least, when I had my kids. My kids were younger. And I met a person on Twitter who, Chris Allen, who was the co-author with me in my first book. And he, at the time, he thought it was really interesting to meet somebody who was not a programmer, but had some interest in logic and some sort of related things. And he sort of convinced me that he would really like to try teaching Haskell to somebody who'd never programmed before. Haskell does sort of have a reputation for being difficult to learn. And most people who learn Haskell, it's not their first programming language, and they've learned one or more, imperative or object-oriented languages before they come to Haskell. So he had some idea that teaching it to at least one person who never knew programming before would give some indication of whether the difficulty with teaching Haskell was because people were coming to it from a totally different paradigm background, and the paradigm shift required to learn Haskell was what was making it hard, or whether it was something else. So we started that. I sort of agreed. I never thought I would like programming, and so I didn't really think I would stick with it. But I heard this talk. There's a saying, and I don't know who originally said it, but there's a sort of saying about a good type system should make any legal program should make it sorry, I'm going to mess it up. That a good type system should make any legal program writable and not make it and make you unable to write any illegal program, right? And so that interested me because, and I'm sorry that I botched it so badly, but,
I said, oh no, that's okay.
Okay. Anyway, so that interested me because when I was a linguist, and I was sort of working in a generative syntax framework, the idea of generative syntax is to come up with a set of rules, syntax rules that could generate any legal sentence in a language and not be able to generate any illegal sentence in a language. And it's very, very difficult to do that. And so even for really well-studied languages like English, it's very, very difficult to do that. And so it kind of interested me, that connection between this idea of type systems and this idea of generative syntax and how they might be connected. So I sort of started getting more serious about learning Haskell after that. And I was contributing more to the book, so that then I became a co-author of the book. And that's how I got started, I guess. I've still never really held like a Haskell job, and so in some sense, I don't really feel like a Haskell programmer. But I've chosen instead to focus on, on teaching other people Haskell and doing more sort of Haskell research, I suppose.
Yeah, it's so fascinating, the story that you have. So you when you say that there was something in your past, the work that you've done, I think as a master's student, you'd been as a linguistics student, you'd been working on a First Nations language.
Yes.
I think it was particularly with respect to verbs. And the role that verbs played in this language, and it was that work that sparked something in you when you learned about what Haskell was. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the connection there, because you have a background in, I'm going to ask you some questions about this, but you did philosophy and linguistics in your university years, and there was a connection between these two things with respect to formal logic.
Right. So if you can kind of think of verbs as you can kind of think of verbs as functions, and so verbs take a certain number of arguments. And so the work that I did that was concentrated on a Salishan language called Coeur d'Alene, which was spoken roughly in the northern Idaho area. It's not quite dead. It seemed like it was going to die at the time when I was doing this work, but there have been some revitalization efforts that are very exciting. Anyhow, so I was, there were a group of us working on doing an analysis of these texts that were collected by a linguist named Gladys Reichard in the 1930s. She had provided some translation of these texts and also some very rough, what we call morphological analysis. These are languages that tend to accrete a lot of prefixes and suffixes on a word rather than have like a lot of individual words in a sentence the way English tends to do. And so she had broken some of the words up into some of their component parts and indicated what some of them might mean, but we were trying to do that more rigorously and standardize them somewhat. So I was involved with that in graduate school, and then I became really interested in the argument structure of verbs, and the argument structure of verbs is really it's really very similar to talking about argument structure or talking about the arguments of a function in a programming language. We do have zero argument verbs, and some verbs are sort of have variadic argument structure. They can take different number of arguments depending on the context. So, that's what I was working on.
And what drew you to philosophy and linguistics in the first place? Is there anything that you can say about that? I mean, I know these kinds of things just kind of come out of people sometimes, but was there anything specific? I mean, it's the same for me. Like if someone asked me that question, I'd have a hard time answering it. But is there anything you can say about that?
Well, philosophy, I always knew when I went to college, I always knew I wanted to major in philosophy. I really got interested heavily in philosophy my senior year of high school. I was a debater. I don't know if you know much about competitive debate, but I was a Lincoln Douglas debater. And so Lincoln Douglas debaters debate, there's two kinds. There's Lincoln Douglas debaters are contrasted with policy debaters. Lincoln Douglas debaters are debating sort of questions of values. So they're questions of whether something should be the case or whether something ought to be the case, rather than like with policy, it's, sort of policy decisions, and they debate very technical questions of fact, whereas the Lincoln Douglas debaters are debating more sort of ideas. And so the policy debaters that I know are going to kill me for saying that facts aren't ideas. But anyway, I got really into being a Lincoln Douglas debater. And I remember, so one of my best friends that year was really into Kant for some reason, which I think is unusual probably for sophomores in high school. He was younger than me. And so he was really into, the categorical imperative and just all things Kant. And I really felt behind because, I moved I moved right before my senior year of high school, and so the school where I had gone before was really rural, and nobody read philosophy there, and I felt really behind. So when I got up there and I realized, well, I'm surrounded by all these kids who are talking about Kant and Plato and all this stuff. I felt like I had to do a lot of catching up to do. So I read a lot of philosophy my senior year of high school. I was in a debate actually, where I had debated this topic already several times. I forget exactly what the proposition we were debating was, but something to do with democracy. And I thought I knew what everybody's counter arguments already were. And then the guy I was debating in this one round stood up and said, well, according to Plato, democracy isn't even good. And it just completely threw me for a loop. And I was like, okay, I have to, I have to read more. I have to catch up on this because I can't be thrown for a loop like this. So that's when I started reading a lot of philosophy. And so I knew going into college that I wanted to study philosophy. And my first year of college, I took an introduction to logic and a survey of Western philosophy, and I also took a philosophy of law class, and they were all really, really interesting. So I stuck with that through the whole 4 years, and even in grad school, I took a couple of philosophy classes. But then linguistics actually, it just happened. I took an intro to linguistics class as an elective one semester, and I didn't know anything about linguistics before I took that class, and I didn't know that I would like it so much, but I just loved it, and I instantly added it as a major and started taking linguistics classes. It was just the right. A lot of philosophy is already talking about, really talking about language, because there's a lot of philosophy focused on, analyzing meaning, right, and the logical structures of language, and so I think there's a really immediate connection. But with linguistics, then it was sort of that structure of language, but we were also, unlike the philosophers, we were sort of gathering empirical data about it and seeing if our theories actually fit the data that we can see in human language around the world, not just the couple of languages that we happen to speak. So, if you speak, like, say, English and German, and you're comparing them and trying to get some deeper idea of what language is all about, well, they're closely related languages, so you're going to have a very skewed perspective. And it interested me to start seeing the data from a whole bunch of different languages that really share very few things in common. And then what can we really say about the universal properties or structures of human language? And so I think it was a really natural fit from my interest in philosophy to that.
Yeah. It's thanks for sharing that story. You were reminding me of some very long lost memories of debating in high school. I in particular got unfortunately paired with someone who was vain and ambitious and not very smart. And so in the way it worked in, like, the school where I was in Canada, in Saskatchewan, just north of you in Montana, was the final words spoken were referred to as the Prime Minister's address or something like that. And so my partner, being vain and ambitious and stupid, always wanted to give, because it had been called the subordinate's address, he wouldn't have wanted to do it. But because it was called the Prime Minister's address, he wanted to give it. And what he would do is, when the opponent was giving the second last statement, he would be writing out on paper, word for word, what he wanted to say without listening.
Oh.
I know. Just like dumb. And you could just see the judges, like, they would, while the opponent was speaking, they would see what he was doing and just be like, you lose.
Yeah.
But anyway, I wanted to ask you about, there's actually, you brought up the categorical imperative in Kant.
Yeah.
So for those listening who might not know, the categorical imperative is this very important concept in philosophy and politics, according to which basically you can only justify an action if it could be accepted as a universal rule.
Right.
So if you would say anybody under similar circumstances could do, if it would be acceptable for anyone under similar circumstances to do a similar thing, then something's okay. And it's really interesting because it's exactly the opposite of another very popular political idea, which is why should I pay for this?
Right.
Why the why should I question? I was listening to there's this great podcast based on an organization called Intelligence Squared in the UK, and where they bring prominent people in front of a crowd to debate a question, and they poll people before the debate and then after the debate to see how it turned out. And there was one, it was about NATO or something like that, and there was a guy who got up and said, I'm from Texas. Why should I care about NATO?
Right.
And there's a connection between these two things of making politics about everybody and making politics all about yourself.
Right.
And I'm not really sure what I want to ask about that. It's just something that I've been thinking about a lot lately because the whole point of a debate is to be persuasive to other people. And I guess that's probably what sparked me, was the thought about my debating partner for whom it was all about himself, and who ended up embroiled in a political corruption catastrophe later.
Oh, no.
Yeah. But anyway, this is a way of saying that, the kind of things that people talk about in philosophy are really important to our day-to-day lives. And so I wanted to ask you a particular question about philosophy. I warned you about this before we started sort of recording. But so you were talking about Heidegger on Twitter.
Yeah.
For those who might not be aware, and I'm going on way too long in a podcast interview with someone else, but just to explain a little bit. So Heidegger was a 20th century philosopher who wrote a great deal about a great many things, particularly subjects like phenomenology. He ends up in the Venn diagram of his philosophy. It overlaps many things, including existentialism. And another thing that it greatly overlaps with is Nazism. He was an unrepentant Nazi. He endorsed it, at the time when many, many, many other people and his colleagues were very dead set against it. This is before the Second World War. And so I'm just gonna read your tweet back to you. This is totally unfair, but I know you're tough and you'll defend it. But so you write, and so anyway, so I should say, part of there's this debate in philosophy about what should we do with Heidegger, because much of his philosophy would appear to have nothing whatsoever to do with the Nazis, but then there he was, this unrepentant Nazi, and he would claim that it was from his philosophy that he got interested in this Hitler guy. So you wrote, and there are many people who say, just to close this off, there are many people who say, oh no, we can separate at least part of his philosophy from his Nazism. And so you wrote, after I learned about it, I could see, reading him, how his own arguments led him to that. So I object when people try to make bringing up his Nazism seem like an ad hominem fallacy. It's a thing that has to be contended with in any honest analysis of his arguments. And that's one of the best tweets I've ever read, and I wanted to ask you, so how did you see his Nazism in Heidegger's philosophy?
Well, it's all right. So it's been a while since I've read Being in Time now, so I may have to speak a bit, be a bit hand wavy about Heidegger's concepts. But I think for a while there, people were trying to really say that the two things could be disconnected, that maybe even a lot of academics felt forced to become Nazis, but they didn't really believe in it. But I think that in particular, not just in Being in Time, and some of his philosophy of technology is perhaps maybe less connected, but I think in Being in Time, when he's talking about the way he talks about sort of being thrown into a culture, and the ways that we have connections to other people, and the ways that sort of people, I'm being very hand wavy, but the ways that people who are like each other are going to have sort of more natural sympathies, and they kind of belong together. And I felt that you can really see the seeds of a kind of racial or ethno-nationalism there. And so I think that seeing I don't know that you can really separate the anti-Semitism from Nazism, but I think you can see the seeds then of the ethno-nationalism, not particularly the anti-Semitism, but the ethno-nationalism there in the way he feels that we're connected to other people around us. I think there are other ways to interpret the sort of care relationships and the the kind of dialogic relationships and the intersubjectivity. I think there are healthier ways that we can interpret those. And so I think that the book still has something valuable to offer, but like you kind of have to acknowledge that taken in one direction, this notion that our identity is intersubjective and related to the identities of the people who are around us can definitely lead you in that direction. It can lead to white supremacy and white nationalism because you think you have some connection with white people that you don't have with people of other races, or in the case of the Germans, that you have some connection with people who are racially German and not these invaders, these outsiders who don't feel the same activity with you.
It's really interesting too. Thanks for bringing up the intersubjectivity thing. It's so interesting, and there's another element to it as well. I was saying before we started this interview that I was many years ago I was asked in a defense of a master's thesis, what role did Kant play in bringing about the Nazis? And it's haunted me ever since because I didn't have a good. I gave a clever answer, but I didn't have a good answer. And one interesting feature that of these, let's say like late 18th century to early to mid 20th century German philosophers was the idea of having a total system. Mm-hmm. That's what philosophy was about, and they had what to many people nowadays would be a really weird kind of world historical view that would drop out of this idea of having a total system, and it meant your philosophy needed to explain actual human history,
right?
And then just given the particular nature of let's say the religious and cultural world they were coming from, this meant you had to explain the Jews,
right?
And so it couldn't be historical accident. There had to be, a sort of about, the diaspora and things like that. And even particularly for some philosophers explaining this so controversial and has such a fraught history, but, the claims particularly on the part of Catholicism about, the Jews killing Jesus.
Right.
And that it's so fascinating but perverse to think of you're writing a philosophy that might be about like Kant, about so many things, about reason and politics, perception even, and then you've got to tie all that into the history of the Jews,
right?
And so it can end up, it can seem to sort of to a contemporary reader where you don't even notice what's really going on underneath a lot of what's being said because you just think it's about the perception or it's about the politics,
right? Yeah, I think that when I took a course on Nietzsche in college, the professor that I had, we talked a lot about how the Nazis sort of used Nietzsche to, promote themselves and this Aryan ideal. And I think I was trying to combine Aryan and ideal into one portmanteau, but how my professor was really sympathetic to Nietzsche and thought that he had been, wildly misinterpreted. And so he gave this whole, sort of alternate reading of Nietzsche in which Nietzsche is sort of anti-Nazi. And, I think that I don't necessarily think that he was wrong about that. I don't necessarily think that he was wrong that Nietzsche was being sarcastic in some of the things that then the Nazis took literally. But it's also a plausible story that Nietzsche fits into that history of German philosophy, and that he was being more literal, and that the Nazis weren't wrong in the way that they interpreted him. And so I think that people need to be really kind of careful about what they say and what the consequences, like how that leads people to reach certain conclusions. And maybe if you didn't intend those conclusions, then maybe you need to rethink what you're saying. I mean, Nietzsche's dead and died long before World War II, so he didn't really have an opportunity if he would have rephrased. But
it's really interesting. You're reminding me of something else. Actually, I found that you wrote about your opposition to philosophical hero worship, and how you wrote that the first two philosophers who really spoke to you were not really very admirable people. And
yeah,
it's interesting. I for some people, and I get the sense that this is totally true for you, and it's totally true for me, that the concept of entertaining a thought rather than sort of holding a thought. Comes naturally. But for a lot of people, it's not like that. They think that if you're sort of writing a paper about Nietzsche, you must, unless you're expressly denouncing him,
right,
then you must be a proponent of his. That
right.
if you, for example, if you take a course on Buddhism, that means you're becoming a Buddhist or something like that.
Right.
And it's these very different mindsets. And so that actually leads me to, so the next question I want to ask you was getting closer to sort of the tech space, which you're now a part of, and you have for a few years now. So you wrote this really struck me. Having a philosophy degree means having a 4-year degree and giving sexists the benefit of the doubt. And it barely caused me a moment's pause. But the difference between that environment and the one I currently work in is staggering. So I've got 2 questions from that. What is it that makes the philosophy environment, do you think, so kind of toxically masculine so often?
I mean, even though by far the majority of my professors in the philosophy department and my fellow students in the philosophy department, by far the men outnumbered the women. I didn't really feel like it was a very toxically masculine space. I mean, I always felt, at least in my own program and stuff, and maybe I was just particularly blessed, but I always felt like it was, all right, it was definitely expected that we would exercise the principle of charity in our reading, and so, we would not just, find that Aristotle is sexist and therefore we're going to dismiss everything else that he says, because then we would have to be dismissing, so much of the history of Western philosophy. But that, your arguments against him, against the more sexist things that you would read, or the arguments that you were taught, would always be sort of bracketed by, okay, we have to assume that, these days he would accept that this also applies to women or whatever. And so I never really felt like it was, that there was this kind of, I guess I'm becoming more familiar with just calling it misogyny, because I'm reading Kate Mann's book Down Girl right now. And if we think of misogyny as not, sort of particular actions of, sort of being overtly sexist towards other people, but in fact a sort of system by which we sort of try to keep women in certain roles. I never felt like my philosophy department, at least, was like that. I always felt like me and the other women there were, full and equal participants in the dialogue, and that our criticisms of philosophy were taken just as seriously as the other students, and nobody said that we should be. One of the things that I hear a lot in the discourse in tech is, so women will bring up something that is clearly sexist, or bring up this kind of culture of misogyny in the tech world, and instantly they'll be asked, to have more empathy for the men who are sexist. And I guess there's a relation to that, being asked in philosophy to read all of these philosophers with, in the most charitable way possible, right? I guess there's a connection between those two things, but here it seems much more like a silencing mechanism, whereas in philosophy, it's like, okay, if you don't read these things with as charitably as possible, then we will never get anywhere because all of our time will be spent, we'll just have to dismiss them because they are clearly sexist. Whereas in tech, it seems like we can't really have an honest conversation about sexism or misogyny because, such arguments are dismissed out of hand. So the charity really only goes one way, and and I think in the philosophy world, it didn't. It went both ways. So we were supposed to read philosophical texts charitably, but our arguments against them were also listened to charitably. Because, of course, sometimes we made bad arguments against them. Right? Mm-hmm. Those arguments were also listened to charitably. And I feel like in tech, it only really ever goes one way. And so the arguments that there are these problems with misogyny in the tech world are not listened to charitably. People are going to argue with me about that because, of course, in Haskel, everybody thinks that the quote-unquote SJWs are taking over the world and oppressing the white men. So people are going to argue with me that it's not being listened to charitably, but I stand by my words.
Yeah, no, that's actually really, if you're up for talking about it, I was very sort of happy and surprised to hear you bring up the concept of charity. This is one of the sort of driving concepts behind my own experience of reading philosophy. And the idea is that the idea behind charitable reading or listening to of someone else's argument it's not being nice.
Right.
It's about someone is saying something or you're reading something that someone else has written and you relate to it as though it means the best and most complex thing you can get out of it.
Right.
It's about bringing your best to what you're reading, and this is where the concept of entertaining a thought becomes so important, right? You're not saying this is what the person intended, this is what the person meant, but taking these words, I can actually see what's the most complex thing I can see in them,
right?
And this is exactly the opposite of the I think his name was Justin Demore.
Yeah.
The guy at Google. It's exactly the opposite of that attitude. It's exactly the opposite of the siren song of, the Jordan Petersons of the world.
Yeah.
Who ask you to bring the least of yourself into your examination of what other people are saying. Right. And what's your experience been of seeing that particularly this kind of phenomenon of it's a profoundly anti-intellectual, which is not an insult, by the way, an anti-intellectual movement that characterizes itself as intellectual under the auspices of the Jordan Petersons. And there's this guy whose name I can never remember, who's a neuroscientist who got in a big fight with Ezra Klein. Anyway.
Yeah, it's funny because in college, one of the most dreaded classes for a philosophy major, you had to pass it with a C or higher. It was required for the major. And it was this class in formal logic. And it was one of our only interactions, I suppose, with the people who were majoring in STEM fields, because for some reason it was an elective for computer science majors, I believe, the formal logic class, because we talked about Turing machines and we talked about, decidability and the lambda calculus and formal logic questions. So that was one of my only interactions with, the computer science majors on our campus. And, they all clearly had the idea that they were more, rigorous and logical than we philosophy majors, right? Particularly probably those of us who were continental philosophy majors. And it was just, so I guess I had to some degree internalize this idea that, programmers are going to be logical people, right? But of course, that can mean different things. And so, and it doesn't necessarily, just because you're able to reason through programs or a mathematical proof, that doesn't necessarily mean that you can reason through verbal arguments about society and values and culture, right? Because those are sort of different things. They don't quite submit to precisely the same kind of logic. Those things they're not quantifiable in the same way that, questions in math and programming might be. So, but I did come to this with this sort of expectation that programmers were all going to be really logical and they were going to be really open to listening to reason. And I've just not found that to be true as long as we're talking about any kind of cultural question, even questions that are about tech culture itself. So like there's always this people arguing about whether or not static typing is good, and the static typing evangelists which Haskell is a statically typed language. And so the Haskellers, or certain subset of the Haskellers, take this really hardline stance pro static typing, right? All the languages should be statically typed. And then there's other people who get angry about that and are, no, statically typed languages are too hard. And so there's this constant clash about this. And it's like, they're not listening to each other in any, and it's not just Twitter. It gets blamed on the medium of Twitter a lot, but it's not just Twitter. In any forum where they're talking to each other, you can see the same kinds of talking past each other that go on Twitter. Just in Twitter, it's some sort of a shortened form of it. And so I really wish that that this idea of being able to like entertain a thought, being able to ask yourself, all right, this thought, it is repellent to me perhaps, but let me entertain for a few moments. What if it were true? What kind of arguments could be marshaled in its defense, right? What kind of evidence could be marshaled in its defense? And because that's what really helps you find, like, you've had some kind of initial emotional reaction against something. Certainly I do all the time, right? I read something and I think, this is sexist and it's terrible. But that's not really a helpful, I mean, it's fine for Twitter to just react to things, but it's not very helpful long term, right? You have to think, okay, beyond my emotional reaction, like what is, if I held this thing to be true for just a moment and thought as well as I can, what if it were true? What if I'm wrong? Right? Then what can I get out of that? And in the end, it makes it makes you understand yourself better. It makes you understand other people better. But it also makes your own, sort of arguments more reasoned and interesting and more likely to be true.
Yeah, it's really interesting that you that this sort of I guess dialectic between the sort of strictures of formal logic that you find in language and the arbitrariness of culture.
Yeah.
And it's the latter part that I think there's a certain type of mindset finds very difficult to embrace.
Yeah.
They'll say that like, well, no, that word doesn't mean that because look it up in the dictionary. And it's like, the dictionary is just one thing
right.
that establishes the meaning of a word.
Right.
Other things are context, and that context is, historically arbitrary.
Right.
And it's very curious. So those you brought up content. It's so interesting. Like one of the things that I found sort of fun researching for this interview is this the totally natural way that you have managed to embrace the formal logic side of things and the arbitrary cultural sort of continental philosophy kind of things, which is I find quite rare. Most people kind of fall on one side or
right.
the other.
Yeah, dogs and cats, lying down together, right?
Yeah, exactly. And it was interesting. I was, so for those who kind of, are slightly offended perhaps because they sense that they're being targeted by, if I'm talking about people who have problems with the arbitrariness of culture or language, you've got lots of friends in philosophy. There's a guy named Rudolf Carnap, for example, and the logical positivists.
Yes.
Who would be very much on your side. What they tried to kind of amputate history and culture from philosophy.
Yeah.
There's a great line in he's got this article called in English, The Elimination of Metaphysics Through Logical Analysis of Language. In the opening paragraph, it always strikes me as how naive this stuff is, but he writes, whether or not these questions can be answered, it is at any rate unnecessary to worry about them. Let us devote ourselves entirely to the practical tasks which confront active men every day of their lives!
Yeah.
Exclamation point.
Yeah.
And it's like, that's hilarious from a certain mindset. From another mindset, that's like, what could be more reasonable than that?
Right.
Let us set aside these things that can't be decided and focus on the things that can be decided.
Right.
And it seems to me that that's sort of like one of the explanations for why the sort of Jordan Peterson types think that they're intellectuals and think that they're philosophers, is that they are thinking, but they're not thinking curiously. What they want is answers.
Right.
If you know what I mean.
Yeah, I do know what you mean. And they want answers for very specific questions, right? Like if I just read a great, he's actually on Twitter, I think he's the last positivist, so he's a Carnap fan, and but he wrote a great blog post the other day about what logic is, and he talks about how really being logical shouldn't lead you to answers. It should lead you to new questions. It should lead you to new ways of looking at the world and trying to see other people's point, because you should be trying to come up with, like, models of the world in which things that other people are saying are true. Now, maybe they're not true in our world, but you should at least be trying to, and that should lead you to new questions. And so it's funny because coming from, I think, a guy who identifies as a positivist and is a big Carnap fan, it's just sort of funny. Struck me as slightly funny, but I think he's right. Like, for me, that's what logic and philosophy are all about. You should always be looking for new questions to ask. And I have this story that I tell people sometimes because I think it's quite funny. But it got me talking about something with Chris Martin, my current business partner. There was a time in college when I joined this group, one of the campus groups they were called the League of Evil Physicists. And the guy who was like the leader of the group, the president of the club or whatever, he insisted that Aristotle was not a philosopher. And so I don't know why this came up in conversation so many times, but I eventually left I was asked to leave the League of Evil Physicists because I kept insisting that no, indeed, Aristotle is a philosopher. But it's like, I think that when philosophy is asking the kinds of questions that can be answered, those tend to then get sort of shunted into other fields. Like if you're asking, so a lot of the philosophy of math started out asking questions that, well, now we have some answers. So some of the questions that they were asking, for example, about decidability, well, now we have some answers about that. And so now it's not considered to be philosophy as much anymore. Now it's math. And some of the questions that Aristotle was asking, well, some of those now have answers, right? They have answers through science. And so they're not considered to be philosophy anymore. So I think there is some perspective under which I can understand his insistence that Aristotle wasn't a philosopher. He was a scientist. But it also seems such a narrow insistence on such a narrow definition of a word that, I mean, I just couldn't tolerate it. Besides that, scientists don't write books of ethics.
Well, unfortunately, they sometimes do.
Unfortunately, yes.
It's a curious phenomenon because it's really interesting, actually, because being an intellectual and being a philosopher brings with it, like, we all sort of accept that there's a kind of elevated status that comes from that.
Right.
And so people who desire elevated status get attracted to it, even though they actually have no interest in it whatsoever. Right. No real interest in it whatsoever, in intellectual endeavors whatsoever. And so they put on their glasses like Rick Perry, or they put on their bow tie. Right. Or they put on their tweed jacket with the leather elbow patches, or even become professors. Yeah. And think, now I've got that elevated status, which is what they're really after. But what they're doing, is not intellectual or philosophical at all. It reminds me of I had this encounter. I'm sure you've had some encounters like this too, but I got in a debate in high school with someone who was a sort of creationist, and I was arguing for evolution and he was arguing against it. Mm-hmm. And it was clear, and this was in like at a Mennonite boarding school in rural Saskatchewan, so it became quite a heated debate, and there were lots of people listening.
Oh,
and
sure.
And I remember my sort of opponent saved the best for last, and it was very clear after, it was sort of, it was obvious that, more or less the position that I'd been taking had kind of won the day. And then he brought out his secret weapon, which was, but if evolution is true, then why are there still monkeys?
Yes.
And what's interesting about that is the side kind of, to me, like I've thought about that since then. It's been a couple of decades, but the solipsism of it.
Yep.
The rhetorical nature of the question, and it's like there's this, if you stop thinking yourself about the questions that you're asking, that's when you're not doing philosophy anymore.
Right.
Because it's a constant challenging of yourself.
Yep.
That you really need to be engaged in. And there's other forms of thinking. They're just not philosophy.
Right. Yep.
So thanks for being game for talking about all that. It's some pretty heavy stuff.
Yeah.
But it is related to what brought you into the Haskel world.
Yes.
And so moving on to the next part of the interview, what is it that, for those who don't know anything about it, what is it that sets Haskell apart from other programming languages and makes it so attractive to? I mean, I've experienced this myself in interviews, with people with a sort of philosophical mindset.
So I think there are several things, and one of them is probably because Haskell started off life as a research language. It wasn't really intended, at least originally, for industrial production programming, and there's still a lot of research that goes on around Haskell and trying out different improvements or extensions to, for example, the type system, and so being really involved in Haskell involves still a lot of debating about, what is sort of the optimal type system, right? And a lot of languages other than Haskell, like within Haskell, there is a fair bit of that experimentation and debate going on, but also several of the languages that are sort of post-Haskell, but related to Haskell pretty clearly, like PureScript and Idris, they're asking different questions, or they're taking some things that we've learned from Haskell or some questions that have come up during these debates, and they're thinking, well, what if we built a language around this idea instead of what Haskell did, right? What if we made some different choices with the type system? And so there's a lot of, that is a certain kind of philosophy, right? That is a certain kind of philosophical question, right? How we can, what is optimal for this human-computer interaction of programming, because a lot of what you're trying to do when you talk about type systems is come up with some way to ask the computer to help you reason through a complex program. That's part of what type systems are for. If we go back to that idea that type systems should help you generate all the legal programs in your language. There, I said it much better this time. and not let you generate illegal programs in your language. So to the extent that we can encode different type systems in a computer, and the compiler can figure out your types for you, to a certain extent, then the debate there is sort of a philosophical question, what's the optimal balance between what the computer should be doing to help program and what the human should be doing, right? And how can there be a cooperation there instead of just, and I don't think Haskell is currently at that optimum. I think it's important because right now it's the one that is, I think, in my opinion, closest to the optimum, while also being sort of a good language for, fast enough and secure enough and so forth for industrial programming. And so right now I think it strikes a balance that few other languages are doing. where we do have some help reasoning about the logic of our programs from the computer, because the computer is type checking programs. And that's not a perfect system by any means, but there is some help there, instead of just, well, I wrote a thing and let's run it and see if it blows up. So
yeah. And just to sort of, I mean, I know in your pedagogical practice, sort of practical examples and working through them is a very important part of teaching.
Yeah.
Just talking about something is very important, but sort of working through something specifically is also very important. And so you've talked about how addition, and then this is, I'm trying to draw the connection between, sort of what's happening in the sort of rough and tumble, sort of very practical hands-on world of what a computer is doing and what people are doing in their calculations and how we describe them. And you've talked about how addition is disjunctive.
Oh, yeah.
Is that right? And multiplication is conjunctive?
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you could just explain that a little bit. So, I mean, how this sort of like because you've also got a really great talk that I'll link to on YouTube about how metaphor underlies math.
Oh, yeah.
So if you could maybe explain a little bit about what you mean what it means to say that sort of addition is disjunctive and multiplication is conjunctive, I think that'll give us a really practical hands-on example of this intersection of logic and what we're doing in our day-to-day activities, calculate.
Right. Okay. So the disjunctive and conjunctive is coming from Boolean logic, and where the idea is that with say a normal Boolean disjunction, which is an or, you've got, true or false equals true, right? And the only time you get a false is when it's false or false. So when both arguments are false. So if we think of false as 0, so if we were going to encode this in a binary system, because it's a two-valued logic, so it's similar to binary arithmetic. It's analogous to binary arithmetic with a 0 and a 1. So if we think of false as being 0, then and 0 is in the same way that false is an identity value, we call it for disjunction. 0 is the identity value for addition. And so the two operations are very closely related. There's other ways that they're related, and if we talk about set theory, then we can see how they are related through I guess it would be through disjoint unions. So when you take the union of two sets, right, if there's the same element appears in both sets, then then we wouldn't have then we would get rid of one of those copies, right? Because because each element in the set should be unique, and so when you take the union of two of them, if there is overlap, then we get rid of those extra elements. But if you take disjoint unions essentially carry information about which set they came from. And so, the number 1 coming from set A and the number 1 coming from set B then are unique. And so we can keep both of them then when we take the union of the sets. And so then there's also a correspondence with addition and with Boolean disjunction, because they behave the same way, and we can encode them all the same way through like binary arithmetic. So then we see that multiplication and Boolean conjunction. With Boolean conjunction, true is the identity value, which would correspond to like 1 in binary arithmetic, and you only get a true because it's like an and so you only get a true if both sides are true. And so true and false is false, and all the rest of them are. And so all the rest of the pairings. And so that corresponds to like multiplication, where multiplication, if we think of false as 0 and true as 1, 1 is your identity value for multiplication, where anything you multiply times 1, it returns that other argument, right? No matter how big the number is, no matter how small the number is, if you multiply it times 1, it's whatever that number is. And it's the same thing then with, it has the same relationship in Boolean conjunction. If you think of true as 1 and false as 0, and you can join them, then You get a 1 only when it's true and true. And the rest of the times, the 0, which we might call the absorbing element or the annihilating element. I really like calling it the annihilator. And that is a mathematical term. So it'll, destroy its other argument.
And so sorry to interrupt, but just so being a non-technical person myself, so and so apologies to anyone listening to this for whom everything is really obvious, but the identity value in addition is 0 because if you add 0 to something, you get the same result.
Right.
And the identity value, and that 0 corresponds to false, right. But the identity value in multiplication is 1,
right.
Because if you multiply something by 1, you get the same result.
That's right.
And 1 is like true and 0 is like false.
Right. So when we talk about an identity value, it's always an identity value with respect to both a set of values and a specific operation. So there's an identity value from, say, the integers for multiplication, but there's not just an identity value in the integers. Does that make sense? It's always with respect to some operation. So.
And an annihilator, that it's just fun to say.
Yes.
Is that like I take anything and multiply it by 0 and I get 0?
Right. So whatever other, information you had in that pairing will get destroyed by the presence of the zeros. Sort of like when you do a set intersection, if one of those is the empty set, then it destroys everything that was in the other set. It just blows it right up.
And is this... There's something about this that's related to I think there's a concept in Haskell that you can't have an empty list. Is that right? Or am I totally making that up?
Well, we have empty lists, and then we have another data type for non-empty lists where you're guaranteed to have no empty lists.
Okay.
But this, when we're talking about lists, like the normal thing you do when you join lists is called concatenation, where you basically take this list and you add them together into one list. And that doesn't change anything in either of the lists, right? It keeps all of the elements, it just joins them into a single list. But we have another way that you can join lists, where you join them sort of pairwise, and you make pairs out of, so like if you've got a list of 1, 2, 3 and a list of 4, 5, 6, then you make little pairs of like 1, 4 and 2, 5 and 3, 6. And you make pairs, and your new list then is this pairwise joining of the lists. And for that one, because that corresponds to products or conjunction, the empty list will also destroy that. You can't make a pair. Okay. You can't make a pairing, like a pairwise list of two lists, if one of them is empty. So.
Okay. And since this is the interview of easy questions, I'm joking.
Yeah.
The next question I wanted to ask you is the one that I'm sure everyone who knows about Haskell has been waiting for me to ask, which is, what are monads? And I've got just as a kind of joke, like when I first encountered this, I was like, oh, Leibniz.
Right, me too.
and I started talking about it, and sort of like, my computer programming colleagues were like, what the hell are you talking about?
Yeah. I was like, so what, we have like little gods in the type system? What is this?
Or little, like, every part of the universe has the whole of the universe in it kind of thing. But so what in Haskell terms, and I know it's actually like kind of a fun subject of debate about burritos and metaphors and things like that. But so what in your terms, how would you explain what monads are to people who are getting into Haskell?
Okay, well, I think that they're kind of hard to explain to people who don't know anything about Haskell, although I've seen some really good write-ups about what they are with like JavaScript. But all right, so what we've been talking about with the relationship between addition, disjunction, and list concatenation, where we add two lists together, and set disjoint unions, when we consider like the relationship between those things, how they all share certain properties, and we can re-encode those in terms of each other. Does that make sense so far?
Not exactly, but it doesn't need to make sense to me. It needs to make sense to people listening. So I'm not smart enough.
No, I want it to make sense to you. But so
Okay.
We talked about the connection between addition and Boolean disjunction, right? How they both have, in some sense, the same identity value, for example. And so there's this connection between them, and we can sort of abstract away from the details about these different sets, say the set of integers and the set of Boolean values. If we consider each of those a set, we can abstract away from the differences between those, because there clearly are differences, right? Like between the set of integers and the two-valued set of Boolean values, right? There clearly are some differences, but if we abstract away from that, we can call that, that's called a monoid. So a monoid is a set, so for example, Boolean values or integers, along with an operation like addition or Boolean disjunction, but we don't have to care about those details, that is associative, so you can regroup it and evaluate it in different orders. Does that make sense?
Okay, let me see if I get this. So
it's easier with visuals, I swear.
Yeah. So I'm thinking back to one of your talks that I was just watching on YouTube last night. So is this the kind of thing where, so let's say I've got two sides to an operation. Mm-hmm. There can be many different operations with two sides to them.
Right.
And so you abstract away from whether it's addition that's happening or multiplication that's happening or concatenation that's happening.
Right.
But there are two sides to it. And that's what makes something, I mean, with respect to the type of thing that has two, and I probably shouldn't have used that word, with respect to the type of thing that has two sides, abstracting away from it, that's a monad of the kind that has two sides to it?
Close. We're getting close. So
okay.
That's what we call a monoid, and there's a type class in Haskell called monoid that is for monoid operations. So monad is sort of a next level, a higher level monoid. So but monad is also, it's complicated because monad is not just a monoid, but also functor. And so functors are
also a fun word to say.
Yes, yeah, and that came from Carnap, actually. The word functor comes from Carnap. But so functors are, at their most basic, they're just like, if we have a type or a value, that has some other layer. Let's say you've got an integer and you want to do some addition to it, but what you have is not just an integer, it's an integer wrapped in some other type, because in Haskell we have these things called higher-kinded types, which are types that take other types as arguments. So they're sort of type-level functions, and that's a lot to go into if you're not already familiar with Haskell. But if you want to do addition on that integer that is wrapped in some other type layer, you have to have a special function called a functor to sort of get at that value. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. And so a monad is a combination of a monoid and a functor. So you've got some integer, say, for example, embedded in some other type context, and you want to chain, because monads are sort of for chaining operations together. And so you want to apply first addition, for example, to that integer, and then you want to do some multiplication to that integer. And at the end, you have to sort of doing addition on that integer and then doing multiplication on that integer, let's say, would generate more type structure. And so then you have to like smash the layers of type structure together. So a monad, where a monoid is a set that has some operation like addition over it that you can do with it. A monad is a set or a type that has such an operation for it. Does that make sense?
Yes, I think so. Yeah, I mean, at least for the next 2 minutes in my working memory.
So I actually wrote.
I should say that one of Julie's really key points that she makes in all of her writing and speaking is that actually seeing examples of things is really important and working through them. And so having these kinds of explaining things or describing things at this abstract level is very important.
Yeah.
But things But things really start to make sense when you do them.
Yes. So I wrote a blog post that attempts to explain what monads are for people. I don't know that it's that the ideal audience is someone who's never programmed before, but the ideal audience is someone who has programmed before, but not in Haskell, and wants to know what monads are without a lot of extraneous information, and it just goes through an example to demonstrate what monads are and what they're for and why we have them in Haskell. Haskell's sort of weird because Haskell's really big on these abstractions. Most of these abstractions come from abstract algebra. So a monoid is a structure in abstract algebra and a monad, and rings and groups and stuff. And and Haskell sort of took that idea that, well, the algebraists and the mathematicians, they talk about these structures, and a structure is a set and some operation over the set and some laws that the operation has to adhere to. And what if we sort of encoded that in the type system? So that's what type classes are all about. Type classes are about encoding these abstractions in the type system, and then the sets in question are types, right? Haskell types. And so Haskell is, and a lot of people find that really off-putting because then there's a lot of mathematical terminology in Haskell. I think it's, I don't know, it's never really bothered me. I see how it can be off-putting to some other people because there's this sort of, when you first start learning Haskell, there's this real jargon overload, because I think that there is, though, so a point that I've tried to make is there is, whenever you start learning any programming language, so I started trying to learn some Java, and we actually ended up writing a blog post for this as well. And there were all these terms that, I just had no idea what they meant. But so many people learn Java in, say, college.
Can you hear me?
And a lot of that jargon comes from C. And so if maybe you didn't learn Java in college, but you did learn C, and so you're already familiar with that jargon. But for me, coming at it from, I learned Haskell first, and I'm comfortable with all of Haskell's jargon, and then the Java and C jargon is all just, I have no idea what they're talking about.
It's really interesting. You're reminding me of something I think you said in a podcast I listened to, where you're like, because of your background in mathematics and logic and things like that, Haskell just and linguistics, Haskell just like, oh, I get it, kind of thing when you sort of first started encountering it. But the connection between HTML and CSS was a total mystery. Yeah, I needed a book for that because I just didn't. Well, and my Chris Martin that I work with now, he really understood them, and he really made it clear to me what the relationship between the HTML and CSS was. But yeah, to me that was just not obvious at all. And so, there's that GIF that always goes around it's from some cartoon that I don't know, but where he's trying to adjust the blinds, and people say it's like using CSS, where you just have to keep family.
Yeah. And you just have to keep pulling on the strings and seeing what happens to, and it's he actually showed me that, no, you can actually learn CSS. And if you sort of think carefully about your CSS and its relationship to the HTML, that it doesn't have to be like that. And that was really, both, eye-opening and very welcome to me. It was very, reassuring to me. I don't like just pulling on things and seeing what happens particularly. I do a lot of experimentation with Haskell but I do a lot of experimentation with Haskell because I'm teaching it. And so I'm trying to find the ways that different things will work, right? Well, what will happen? Because some student will ask me what happens if you do, X, Y, and Z? So I want to know what happens if I do that. So I do a lot of experimentation for teaching purposes, but if I'm actually sitting down to write a program, or if I'm actually sitting down to design a website, I just wanted to sort of know what I'm doing to the largest extent possible, I don't, a lot of my friends who are programmers say stuff like, I just need to get in there and build it and learn while I'm building and stuff like that. And to me, that's such a frustrating experience. I want to feel like there are, yes, there are ways, like correct ways to do this, and you can discover them and you can learn them, and they're part of a reasonable system. And not just like, well, anything goes and you just gotta sort of hammer away at your keyboard like the 1,000 monkeys trying to type Shakespeare or whatever, right? And eventually Shakespeare will come out. I don't like that at all.
So the last before we move on to the last part of the interview, the last question I have to ask you about Haskel. So we've got Julie Moronuki here, who literally wrote the book on Haskel, and we've built up these concepts so far of monoids and monads and annihilators and functors. So what are semi-rings?
Oh, yeah, I'm writing about semi-rings right now, actually. So semi-ring is when you have two monoids basically that are in a relationship with each other. So again, if you think about addition and multiplication, and there's a relationship between addition and multiplication in a couple of ways. One of them is that the identity value of addition, which is 0, is the annihilator of multiplication. So there's that connection between the two. And the other connection is that multiplication distributes over addition. And I know I learned that when I was in, elementary school. We talked about distributivity and how I always have a hard time doing this when it's not on paper, but I think it's like if you have, A times, in parentheses, B plus C, that's the same as A times B plus A times C. Does that make sense? Okay. Yes. Like I said, I'm really bad at doing that just in my head. So, and so what's called the absorption law, where there's that relationship with the identity of one thing being the annihilator of the other, and then the distributivity law connects, like, say, addition and multiplication. And so a semi-ring is an algebra with some set, such as integers, for example, where you have two monoids, such as addition and multiplication, and those are binary operations that have identity values. And they're connected by that absorption or annihilation, and also by the distributivity. So integers under addition and multiplication are semi-ring. There's also so Boolean logic also can form a semi-ring because there is that relationship between conjunction and disjunction. There are also some semi-rings that are different, in which one of the operations is not addition as we usually think of it. And so there are things that are a bit of a stretch to see how they're related to those. But then Haskel's type system also forms a semi-ring, because we have what are called sum types and we have product types. And the relationship between sums and products in Haskel's type system is the same as or analogous to the relationship between addition and multiplication. And so semi-rings are really interesting algebra that I'm kind of getting into lately. Tropical semi-rings are really fascinating. They're one of the ones that I think are kind of an extension. They're kind of a stretch to at first see how they're related to these other semi-rings, because the other ones are a little bit more analogous to each other. And their tropical semi-rings are interesting because they're a little bit of a stretch. And so I've been reading a lot about them lately, and they're quite fascinating. So,
well, thank you very much for that great description. Speaking on the subject of hard things, you co-wrote a book. You've done it a couple of times. But writing a book with another person can be very hard.
Yeah.
How did you and your current business partner, Chris Martin, work out a process for writing together?
Yeah, our process for writing together, I think, is quite different from the process I went through for the first book. So Chris and I work well together because we have really distinct strengths and weaknesses. So I really like writing with him because he always makes me see things from a perspective that I just couldn't see before. It's not just because he like he's been a programmer for a long time, and that was what he majored in college, and he knew he wanted to be a programmer when he was a kid, and he became a programmer, and like, so he has just so much more knowledge about programming in general, and he's written so many other languages than I have and stuff like that. So that's part of it, but part of it also is just we have really complementary skills too, and so our process usually is that one of us writes something and then the other one sort of edits and improves it. And we go back and forth. Like for type classes, we don't, stuff that we publish on type classes, we usually don't have an attribution. So most pieces on type classes were written by one or the other of us and then just edited by the other one. But for the books, we have to choose an order in which to list the co-authors, right? So the next book that's coming out, he'll be the first author on, and then I'm going to be co-author because my role for that is more going to be the editor and critic of it, right? And so that's how we do. So like I wrote Finding Success in Haskell. I wrote mostly by myself, and then he was the critic that came along and read it and told me the things that were wrong and the things that were unclear and the things that maybe needed more examples. And so that's sort of our process. And then I go back and edit it and he rereads it. And so that's a fairly simple process. And I really like it because I think it's so easy when you write by yourself to become, to let yourself think that, well, I've worked through this, and everything that I've thought of, all the counterexamples that I've thought of, were, I've dealt with all of those, and so I must be correct, right? I must have thought of everything. And then when you work with even just one other person, you find how many things that you didn't even think of.
It's interesting. You're reminding me of something you spoke about once, about how if you come up with a mathematical proof but you can't convey it, it's kind of effectively not
right.
true. Because it needs to be other people need to understand it. In order for it to be a true proof, in a sense. And there's a really interesting sense in which that's the case. And so the process of writing means it's about conveying something successfully to other people. And so you chose LeanPub as the platform for your latest book. What was the reason for that?
It just seemed like a very frictionless way to get it published, and it had the right tools for offering something in early access, and it's very accessible, it's very widely accessible, and certainly like in our little niche of the world, right, in sort of tech self-publishing, everybody's heard of it, and so it's not, you're not going to be referring people to some site to buy your book that they've never heard of, and they are like, I don't know if I can trust their security in taking my payments and stuff like that. But it was just so the support for like different formats and stuff just was really just frictionless and nice. So we had we thought at first, we'll give it a try and see how easy it is to first get it uploaded and get a page made for it, and then if we don't like it, we can always move it somewhere else, right? But so far I think we've been really happy with the how easy it is to keep it updated and for everybody. We haven't had any complaints with people who've bought it and then my first book was on Gumroad, and we had some problems where, not to talk bad about them, I guess, but we had some problems where people couldn't get their download, or their download got badly mangled or something like that. And we haven't had any of that kind of thing on LeanPub. So it's just been a very frictionless experience. And so.
Oh yeah, thanks for sharing that. That's really interesting. That the kind of stuff, it's not the kind of thing we often hear about directly, so that's very good. And every service, we don't talk badly about anybody, and every service has their issues. One of the things that because in particular LeanPub, kind of genetically is about in progress publishing.
Yeah.
And with technology and things that change quickly, one thing we're sort of like confident about is that handling situations where something doesn't work quite right is actually we're built for solving that or resolving that. And, you know, for example, we make it really easy to get refunds.
Right.
And that's partly because, you know, we want people to feel like buying a book is kind of like online. An ebook is the equivalent of taking it off the shelf, you know, in a bookstore and thumbing through it. And if you don't like it, well, you can kind of put it back. But this is not the way that all sort of online,
right,
you know, bookstores work. And so one really interesting thing, I just learned this last night. So do you use Haskell to produce your ebook files?
Yeah.
So I just got to say, like, one of the pleasures of having such sophisticated authors is that one of the reasons we built you for your book, you're using our Bring Your Own Book writing mode, where you don't use any of the tools that we provide for writing a book. You use all of our really sophisticated, like, you know, bookstore features, but you produce your own ebook files, and lots of people have their own very opinionated ways of doing this, and you have a particularly opinionated.
Yeah, we started that actually when we started writing together. Although our original version was, I think, more, I guess, more sophisticated. But that's the intent is to use that with a much longer book, and because one of the problems with tech writing, right, is keeping it updated, and especially like the Haskell compiler changes a lot, and so most of the stuff that we used in this particular book isn't going to change very much, and so we expect it will continue to compile, and all the code will work for some time. But in the bigger, there's another book that we're writing, and in that one, a lot of the stuff that we're writing, it's a lot more up for grabs whether it will continue to compile 6 months from now. 6 months might be an exaggeration, but and we want to be able to keep it updated, and so we developed this whole thing that automatically tests all the code in the book, like every time we build the book, and so we took a sort of subset of that, since this one is less complicated and also much shorter. We took a sort of subset of that, and the book is built with Haskell and Nix, and
is this process public? Is it something that other people can find out?
It isn't yet, but we are intending to make it public. Yeah. So
okay. Well, please let us know.
Yeah.
When you do that, because we'd love, I'm sure our authors, whether they adopt it themselves or not, you know, many of our authors love hearing about how other authors.
Yeah.
think.
Yeah. Well, it's one of those things that I think, like, I know a lot of people, because I go around and teach Haskell workshops. Mostly I teach Haskell workshops to people who I don't think they have the idea that they'll ever become like a full-time Haskell programmer. They're just sort of interested in it and want to know, they're curious. And which I think is great and to be encouraged. And so one of the things I've discovered is that, like, a lot of them would like to have some kind of Haskell sort of side project where they could be using Haskell in some fashion, but not have to be constantly, marinating in it. And I've recommended to a lot of them, there's a static site generator written in Haskell called Haskell that lets you tinker around with Haskell's monads. I think there's so much documentation for this static site generator, and so many people have written blog posts about, well, I wanted to tweak it to do X, that I think if you play around with it as a side project, like, you can get a really good exposure to Haskell. And I think that I'm sort of hoping that our book building library package, when we get ready to release that, and a couple of the other packages that hopefully we'll be releasing, will, I hope, give people more sort of opportunity to do that. So,
yeah, well, thanks very much for that. I'm sure people will be really interested in seeing it when
yeah.
The last question I always like to ask on this podcast is, if there was one thing we could build for you on LeanPub, or one thing we could fix for you, can you think of anything you would command us to do?
Ooh. So This just came up today, actually, and there's a Haskel conference going on right now that we are one of the sponsors of, called ZuriHack in Zurich, and we made a coupon code for the ebook for ZuriHack attendees as part of our sponsorship, but since you can't actually enter a coupon code, as far as we can tell, like at checkout or whatever, you have to give people this slightly awkward and long URL. And so I wish that you could just give them just the coupon code and they could just go buy the book and use the coupon code.
Yeah, so thank you very much for that. We always love them. I mean, the more specific the feedback we get is, the better. And so we used to have coupon codes, and as you're explaining, what we provide instead is coupon links. And so the way that works is, there'll be www or whatever .leanpub.com / well, actually no www, just leanpub.com / your book URL / and then you can create a coupon code. So it could be ZuriHack 2019 or something like that. But you do have to provide people with the entire link in order for them to be able to redeem the coupon. And one of the reasons, so we used to have coupon codes. So there'd be a little box, enter the coupon code. And one of my co-founders will get mad at me if I'm misrepresenting this, but as I recall, because it was quite some time ago, the reason we switched to links rather than coupon codes is that if people go to a page and see a coupon code box, they're like, well, where's the coupon code?
Oh.
And so they feel cheated if they don't have the coupon code.
Interesting.
But someone else does. And so what that means is that basically, I mean, it's a negative experience for the customer, right? Because they're like, well, if only I had that coupon code, I could be paying less for this. So there's this secret club out there of coupon code havers, and I'm not one of them. And so I believe this is actually one of the reasons that, if you listen to podcasts and they're like, go to, Great Courses Plus / Ezra Klein or something like that. That's the reason it's done that way. Rather than providing a coupon code box, it's kind of like a secret only for those. And so you don't want to reveal that there's a secret to people who don't have the secret.
Interesting.
Because then they feel kind of cheated or left out.
Interesting. Coupon code boxes, I think, are fairly common on like retail sites.
No, it's. I'm not saying it's kind of like a settled thing.
No,
because people, if you go to the grocery store, you probably know that, if only I'd, didn't put up that no junk mail sign, I'd have gotten a big thing full of coupons. So it's not a settled thing, but our opinion was that we wanted, after having had a coupon code box, we're like, let's do it. Let's do it. The coupon.
No, it's really. Yeah.
But we really appreciate hearing that your expectation was for a coupon code box. It's always good for us to hear that.
Yeah, no, that's and it's really interesting for me to hear the other side of that. So thank you. Yeah, interesting. I'm gonna go tell Chris.
Well, thank you very much, Julie, for being game for questions on all kinds of different things and for taking the time out of your day to talk to.
Yeah, well, this was a really interesting conversation. It wasn't. I don't think it was like any other podcast I've been on. So, thank you for. Nobody else has asked me about Heidegger.
I've been doing this for years, and I've been waiting all this time to ask that question. So, thanks very much.
Yeah.
And thank you for you and Chris for using LeanPub for your latest book.
Yeah.
We really appreciate that too.
Thank you for providing the service. Like I said, it's been a good experience so far. So.
Okay, thanks. And thanks, as always, to all of you for listening to this episode of the Front Matter podcast. If you heard a couple of blips in the audio, you're not crazy. They really were there, but I don't think they really got in the way. If you like what you heard, please rate and review us wherever you found us, particularly on iTunes. And if you'd like to be a LeanPub author, please go to our website at leanpub.com. Thanks.